Good morning, everyone. The bell will ring, I'm sure. We're in Genesis 39. Hopefully we'll get through even 41, but we'll see. So kind of what we're doing is we're looking at the life of Joseph. So that's we're not going to, there are pieces of the Genesis 37 to 50 that we're not going to really spend a lot of time with. So last week we introduced this from Genesis 39. And at the end of Genesis 37, at the end of Genesis 37, it says, verse 36, "Meanwhile the Midianites had sold him to Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard." And so that's where Genesis 39 is going to pick back up. As we see there in Genesis 39 at verse 1, now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, here we're emphasizing again, an Egyptian had brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. So we kind of mentioned this last week that there's an interlude. It's not an interlude in the story of Jacob, but in the story of Joseph, it's kind of an interlude. And in Genesis, the 38th chapter, the focus switches from Joseph to Judah. And there's that whole discussion that happens in Genesis 38, and Judah and Tamar, and the point, I mean, not the only point, but one of the things that comes from that is the importance that that story becomes in the New Testament, right? Because as of the result of that, you have the birth of somebody known as Perez, right? And so that's going to be in the genealogy of Christ, right? So you have all of that in there. But the other thing to remember is what direction were the sons of Jacob going? How were they acting? Versus now what we're looking at, Joseph, who doesn't have family, who doesn't have friends, who doesn't have acquaintances, who doesn't know the land, who's not familiar with the surroundings, who doesn't have his normal, what he does day in and day out, none of that. And yet, in the midst of it, we see the faithfulness of somebody that's not even like us, right? He couldn't sit down, when all of this was going on and say, well, I'll just read what God has to say. All he had was the things that he had been told by his family. Right? Isaac and Jacob, his father, but Isaac had been around at least for part of it. And so they're the ones that have been telling him the things that led to this kind of a faith. I mean, he could see it demonstrated in his life too. But so those are kind of some of the things to keep in mind as we go into the Joseph story. The other thing to remind ourselves of is that the Joseph story is one of the kind of longest until we get to Moses, right? So when you kind of look at how much is being told to us in these chapters, the focus on Joseph, it's really a very long narrative. And then think about how many miraculous things are happening in this. We see a lot of providential things that come up and how all of that works together. We have dreams and the interpretation of dreams. I don't know about you, but I have dreams. But I'm not looking for my dreams to tell me about what God wants me to do. If I can remember them, they might have something to do with today or what happened yesterday or something like that. But other than the giving of dreams in this case, which were prophetic and Joseph being given by God the proper interpretation of that, you don't see the miraculous things happening. We don't have a record of God coming to Joseph like God had come to Abraham, like God had come to Isaac, like God had come to Jacob. Right? Numerous times, and God said to Abraham, right? Or Abraham is there looking over the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and somebody's speaking with them, right? You have the different times that God comes and reiterates the promises to Isaac. God comes and reiterates the promises to Jacob. He's going to have to do that again before we're done to convince Jacob it's okay for you to go to Egypt with Joseph. But all of that, when we get to Joseph, what does Joseph have? He's had 17 years in his father's house. He's heard what his father and his grandfather and their people have had to say. And he's had some brothers that apparently don't like him a lot. So his family dynamic, right? He didn't grow up in great, the interaction within the family wasn't great. And yet we see him here. So that's going to be our plan this morning to kind of get through, and I'm spending a lot of time introducing that. So we'll pick up here in Genesis chapter 39. And it says there that Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer of his house and all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in his house and field, so he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And that's kind of where that stops. So there's our introduction to Joseph now in Egypt and the things that are going on. And so that's where we'll pick up our discussion, but before we get into the rest of the lesson, let's offer a word of prayer. Our great God and Father, we're indeed grateful that you provide us so much information and that we have this opportunity to come together and to strengthen ourselves and strengthen one another in your holy truths. And help us, Father, to seek the opportunities to trust you in situations that may not seem to make sense at the time, and to endure with our love and grace, endure in the love and the grace and the mercy that you shower upon us in your Son and our Savior, in whose name we now pray. Amen. So, after this, right, we read these verses, right? Verses 5 and 6. The success that Joseph has, and it's noticed. Now, I do want to point out that it says that the Lord, right? And I tried to do it in this slide where the Lord is in the small caps, which most of us know that's that 4 letters in Hebrew that we either say is Jehovah or Yahweh, right? But in Exodus chapter 3, when God meets Moses at the burning bush, is when that's revealed, what that name is. I think it's even the name itself, but especially what the name means. I am that I am, or I'm, right? That's normally what that tetragrammaton, the 4 letters, are considered to be. YHVH or YHWH. And so that becomes a question of, well, how is all of this going on now if that hadn't been revealed? Well, the question becomes, who's writing it, right? And who's he writing it for? Right? This is Moses sometime in the wilderness. He had some 38 years, right? I know it's a total of 40, but they spend about 2 years at Mount Sinai getting everything for the tabernacle ready and all of that kind of stuff. So about 38 years he's going to be in the wilderness, so he's going to have time for God to give him this kind of information and present it to them. And so they would understand that, yeah, they may not have known Yahweh at that point, but they did recognize that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was with Joseph. Well, at least Joseph apparently understands that or gets that from it. And when it says that they noticed that the Lord was with Joseph, okay, do they know the way that maybe Jacob and Joseph know? Or are they just normal polytheistic people? Oh, and that guy seems like stuff is going good. His God must be on his side. And if his God is able to do all this through him, then maybe we ought to buddy up with him so some of that will come out on us too, right? So I just from a purely, if I believe in all sorts of gods and all sorts of gods can do all sorts of things, and I see somebody that seems to be devoted to some God and stuff's going good for him, well, then I'm going to pay attention to that. It kind of makes sense to me. I don't know if it makes sense to everybody. But most of us at that point kind of know the story that Joseph's time in Potiphar's house continues. Notice that it said that he was in Potiphar's house. I don't know how many people had their servants living in their house, right? But that does seem to be sort of the progression that's here. I may be reading a little bit too much in it, but there was this recognition that things were going well, right? And think back to some of the statements that God had made all the way back, in the teens, Genesis 12 and beyond. 15, Genesis 15. Those who bless you, I will bless, right? Isn't that one of the promises that God made to Abraham and reiterates to Isaac? So you have this thing where Joseph's faith, Joseph's trust on the information that he had been provided by his family, right? There's no texts for him to study. There's no group that he can go to and say, hey, let's get together and work this out and figure out what's going on because we read this. None of that's going on. And yet Joseph trusts. So think in terms of providence. Do you notice how many little things mean a lot in Joseph's life? All of a sudden, there's some traders that are coming by his brothers, and they think, hey, instead of killing him, let's sell him. And they weren't heading from Egypt, they were heading to Egypt. And then this guy, captain of the guard, a high official, ends up being the one that buys Joseph. And then, with what we're getting ready to read, he's going to end up being unjustly accused and end up back in a prison, right? He calls it the pit, right? His brothers threw him in the pit, and after this episode with Potiphar's wife, he talks about being back in the pit. So it said there at the end of verse 6, now Joseph was handsome and form in appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast his eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concerns about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in his house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And she spoke to Joseph day after day. He would not listen to her to lie beside her or to be with her. So this is where Joseph has progressed in Potiphar's house to the point that he's become so familiar that Potiphar's wife casts her eye upon him and wants to seduce him. And he reiterates and reiterates and reiterates, no. That's an interesting, I was reading one of my Jewish commentaries, and there in verse 8, but he refused. I don't know if y'all know this, but the cantor will chant the readings in the synagogues for the Sabbath services, right? They have a cantor, and we went to a bar mitzvah, and the young man that was being bar mitzvah had to have his little section that he quote unquote read, but there was a little chant as he was reading, and that's part of what this particular, they're called trophs. Anyway, what it means is that when the cantor comes to this particular word, he can drag it out. So I'm not going to try the Hebrew word because I can't really say it, but it would be very much like me reading verse 8, singing it and singing it as he refused, and just dragging it out to let us know that the understanding is that this wasn't, she just said this once and he said no. No, it was kind of this, it was a constant temptation, and his ultimate response is, if I do this, I'm going to sin against God. Where'd that come from? It's Potiphar, it's Potiphar's wife. How did God enter the picture at this point? So that's Joseph's faith. That recognition that ill-treating someone else is really an affecting my relationship with God. And so for how, right? Joseph didn't have a book to know that. Somehow in Jacob's family, he had figured that out. So to me, it's fascinating when you contrast this with what Judah did. Or, right, I mean, we can go back even further than that with Reuben and stuff. But, I mean, you've got all of that that's kind of going on. At that point, she conspires to get this taken care of, right? She wants this to happen. But one day, verse 11, when he went out into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Poor Joseph leaving his garments behind causes, right? His brothers take his garment and show to Jacob, and now Potiphar's wife is going to take this garment and show it to Potiphar. Anyway, so she caught him by the garment and saying, "Lie with me." That's verse 12 again. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Paul to Timothy, right? Flee youthful lust. How old is Joseph at this time? We don't know exactly, right? We know that he was 17 when he was sold. So how many years later is this? I don't know. Is it just months? He's going to spend, right, until he's 30, either in prison or as a slave, one or the other, right? So we've got quite a bit of time here between him being in Potiphar's house, rising to this occasion, this episode happening, being thrown into prison, back into the pit, the dream, rising to authority in that prison, to the point where these other two guys come in and reiterate their dream. So, I mean, there's going to be, like I say, there's 13 years. There's going to be 11 till the cupbearer and the baker, and then there's another 2 years. And so he's going to be 30 when all of this is over. And we have nothing in here, at least I don't see it, where, and God said to Joseph, right? Fear not, I am with thee. We don't have that. So what happens? Verse 14, she called to the men of her household and said, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. And he came into me to lie with me, and I cried out in a loud voice. And as soon as he had heard, I had lifted up my voice and cried out. He left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant or slave whom you brought among us came into me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside and fled out of the house. Verse 19, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. Put a stop there. It doesn't say who. It just says his anger was kindled. And what's his response? And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners are confined, and he was there in prison. He doesn't have him executed, right? He doesn't sell him. He doesn't send him, off to work in some mine or something like that. So you just kind of wonder, at least I do, what's poor Potiphar really upset about? The guy that's been running my house, I hadn't had to worry about anything except to sit down and eat. And the only thing I've had to worry about, and now now I got to figure all that out again. Again, I don't know. But he's upset, and now Joseph is back in prison. And verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. That word sometimes is translated as mercy or loving kindness. It's a covenant word. It's faithful to the covenant. And a lot of times it's used of God when people get into problems, and yet God is still faithful to the covenant. And so we see that as mercy, as loving kindness. God's devoted to this covenant. The word is hesed. It's that idea of God fulfillment and the riches, the blessings that come with that. But again, it's really a faithfulness term. God is faithful to his covenant. And we experience that as mercy, as loving kindness, those kinds of things. And so the Lord was with him, and verse 22, and the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he's the one that did it. And the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. And so we see again trust that led to success, mistreatment that led to more trust that leads to more success. So part of this is, one of those things. Joseph doesn't seem like he's given up on God. Through all of this, through his family, brothers don't want to have anything to do with him, talked about killing him, all that kind of stuff. And yet his devotion is such that, we would know, or maybe we wouldn't, if he hadn't have been faithful. Maybe God would have moved in a different direction. But all of this comes to us in these kinds of situations. So the Lord was with him, whatever he did, and the Lord made it succeed. And so we got some more time, right? Chapter 40 begins. I have a verse I want to bring up. I kind of have hinted at it. Turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 2. And if you drop down to verse 21, right? So verse 20, what credit is it if when you sin you are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Verse 21, For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return, and when he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So we see kind of a mini picture of that in Joseph, in his endurance. So now he's going to spend some time in prison. He has risen successfully in Potiphar's house, wrongly accused, back in the pit, has risen successfully. He's got a lot of responsibilities. I guess modern say he'd been made a trustee, right? Here at this particular place. And now Pharaoh gets upset with some of his high-ranking officials. Chapter 40. Sometime after this, we're not given the exact timing, but sometime after this, so Joseph has been in the prison again for a while. The cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was angry with his two officers. I'm going to make a point here. There is an Egyptian word for king that's not Pharaoh. So they understood the concept of the king. Pharaoh was a specific title, right? It means big house, probably. And this is the guy that lived in the big house. But the idea that they could interchangeably use the idea of king and Pharaoh, right? It's not that there's... And the only reason I bring that up is because you get critical scholars who try to say that this was all people that wrote and then somebody tried to stitch it all together. They understood the idea of royalty and all of those kind of things, but they had a specific title for their king. They called him Pharaoh. All right, so Pharaoh was angry, verse 2, of his officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Uh-oh. Who is that? That's who was, if you go back, right, to chapter 39, but he's not mentioned by name here. So I don't know, right? I don't know if there'd been a changing of the guard, any of those kind of things. It's been some time, right, since Potiphar had bought him and then ultimately put him into prison. It's just now we're told that he's now with this captain of the guard. Anyway, it's an interesting piece. We're not given the full details. All we know now is that he's back at this place where Joseph was confined. Now, verse 4, the captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them and continued for some time in custody. So again, we have this situation where not only has Joseph risen in success within the prison, but there's this special duty that is now assigned to him to take care of or be associated with these two high officials of Pharaoh's court. Verse 5, and one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled, so he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, why are our faces cast down today? And they said to him, we've had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said, you don't know anything about how much problems I've had. Let me tell you, no. Okay, what's going on with you? Not that he's not going to bring up his own difficulties. He still is interested in them, right? He wants to know. And maybe it's because he's afraid that if they're all sad and he's the one in charge, he might get in trouble. I don't know if that's part of it. I think it's just this genuine desire to know, why are these guys upset? And he says that we dreamed dreams and there was no one to interpret them. We're going to come back to this in Pharaoh's dreams. I'll just mention it really briefly, kind of quickly. The Egyptians had dream books or dream scrolls. And these are laid out, and they have the item in one column, and then they have in the next column whether it's good or bad or neutral, and then in the third column it's kind of a prognosis / result. What are the consequences? So, if you see a bird flying and it falls into the water, that's a bad omen, and then that means that half of your crops are going to be destroyed, or something like that. It'd be odd things like that. But they would just, and so when we get to Pharaoh later on, but they're saying this, there's no one to interpret because they can't go to one of the places where the priests have the dream books and they can ask them what it means. So they know we've had this dream and we're upset. And so what does Joseph say? So verse 8 again, they said to him, we have had dreams and there's no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. And the focus of that is apart from God, there's no interpretation. And Joseph is not going to claim, hey, I can interpret these dreams. But the Lord can. He doesn't say the Lord, but God can do that. And it's not up to me. Let me know what your dreams were. And if the interpretation is there, it's there. So they go on. Well, the cupbearer starts, right? Verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told the dream to Joseph, and he said, in my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. And as soon as it budded, its blossom shot forth, and the cluster ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. I'm going to stop there. The only remember me we'll talk about. So when we get here in the prison, there are these dreams that happen. And so the first one is the cupbearer. Notice there's a lot of triplets in what he says, right? The vine, right, with 3 branches, it budded, blossomed, clusters ripened. Pharaoh's cup, Pharaoh's hand, or the cup in Pharaoh's hand. So you have the cup mentioned 3 times, you have Pharaoh mentioned 3 times, you have all of these triplets in this. Again, part of that emphasis of how sure and complete these things are. And now there's going to be another one, right? So we're going to get 2. But I want to spend a little time. I want to mention verse 14 and following, 15. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me in the pit. And he's using the same phrase that's used all the way back in 37 of what his brothers did to him. They threw him in the pit. And he talks about, I'm in the pit again. So that's the story of this. So there I have commentaries that call this like a lack of trust. And I think that is just such a shallow response to this. And generally, when I kind of dig through it, is they're kind of faith-only people, right? And so Joseph has been in prison or been a slave for 11 years at this point. And to fault him for saying, remember me, because, if all you do is sit around and wait on miracles, what are you going to do yourself? Not a lot, right? You're just going to sit back and, well, God's going to do it. I don't have to do it. I'll just wait on God. So that's one of the problems. And then two, generally we're going to be really disappointed in God because it's not going to turn out the way we thought God should have turned it out. Right? That's going to be with Joseph. Joseph never really goes home, right? He gets out of what the situation is, but it's not going to be a return to the way things were. So anyway, it's just something to keep in mind. If you read a commentary and they go off on Joseph's lack of faith here, just observe the Passover and go on. Okay, verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, oh, that sounded good. What Joseph just said to the chief cupbearer, that sounded good. He's going to get to go back to work, and Pharaoh's going to be happy with him. So I'll tell you mine now. I'll tell you mine. He said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of bread, baked foods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. 3 baskets or 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. Now, that's not favorable, right? But I want us to notice something first. Joseph had 2 dreams. There are 2 dreams here, 2 different people, but they're tied together. And then Pharaoh's going to have 2 dreams. And one of the things that Joseph says later on when Pharaoh has 2 dreams, it's doubled, you know it's sure. So what Joseph had experienced, doubled, true. Here, this is a doubling. Both of these things happen just as Joseph says. So when we get to Pharaoh and Pharaoh has 2 dreams, we know about the surety of what's being said. So we have it on this occasion that on the 3rd day, verse 20, I needed to go back. We talked about this. Only remember me, because that's going to come back up again. So on the 3rd day, right, which was the Pharaoh's birthday, can I just point out that that's the only time that we read of a celebration of a birthday? And there are a lot of people make a big deal about celebrating a birthday, right? This is the only birthday celebration that we have. I don't know. I'm not sure if that means anything, right? But that's here, and he's not saying that he should, he's just saying that on Pharaoh's birthday there was this celebration. There's background to that. There are other people at this time write records from different empires or whatever, nations or whatever you want to call them, going on all the way from Mesopotamia all the way in this crescent down into Egypt, where the ruler, either at the anniversary of his birth or the anniversary of his ascension to the throne, oftentimes would, as a gracious act, release prisoners. And one of the things that they would do is the prisoners would come and they would bow, and then when they would be acknowledged, they would be able to lift their heads, right? They would be acknowledged, and so Pharaoh is going to do something. I've acknowledged you, I'm going to do something. In one case it's good, in one case it's bad, right? So what happens is that, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. So whatever else is going on, he's acknowledged them, and I'm going to do something for you, right? Verse 21, he restored the chief cupbearer to the Pharaoh's, or to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. So there you see the completeness of that arc. It goes all the way back to, what is it, verse 11? Yeah, verse 11. And he put the cup in Pharaoh's hands, right? Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, the end of verse 11. So there you have that. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Now, whether or not he beheaded him first could very well be. The point of hanging him on a tree to the Egyptians where the flesh would be eaten, did anybody have any clue why that was? They believed, right, their afterlife belief was you needed the mummy. That was the continuation. Why did Egyptians not colonize? Because you needed to be buried in Egypt. And they didn't want to be in foreign lands, right? So most of the time, Egypt just went out, would run around, destroy as many villages that they could, take all the loot that they could, and then they'd hightail it back to Egypt. They didn't want to colonize. They didn't want to have outposts, any of that kind of stuff. Because if they needed stuff, they'd just go back next year and take it, right? So all of this time going up into Canaan and all of that kind of stuff, they just went on raids and then came back home because they wanted to be mummified and they wanted to be buried in Egypt or in a tomb in Egypt because that was their view of the afterlife. So this statement here would have been doubly bad. Not only would he die, he would be, at least in his mind, removed from the afterlife. He'd be just wiped away. They had some spells, supposedly, that you could say, and anyway, they had ways around it, but that's kind of the situation that we're in. The sad part is, right, it's almost like John 1:11, he came into his own and his own received him not. Here, yet, verse 23, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Now that's another double. Right? There was apparently nothing going to happen, right? He didn't remember, he forgot him. And it almost seems like it might be not personal, but it's something that it was a decision that he made not to remember him. But think about it for a minute. Well, we kind of know what's going to happen, right? If I've jumped too far ahead, y'all can tell me to just stop for a second. Right, the next part of it in chapter 41, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. So poor Joseph not only has been 11 years slave, prison stuff, he now thinks that maybe this guy will say something. And he's going to wait another 2 years. But, right, if you think about it, what would have happened to Joseph if the cupbearer had said it 2 years ago to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh had looked into it, and Pharaoh had decided, Joseph, you shouldn't be in prison. Why don't you just go away? We don't know where Joseph would have been at this time. So again, there's some providential things that are going on, some small things that we may not always see. And that can be true in our own lives, right? That there can be small things that we don't necessarily see or understand. But that doesn't mean that we should just give up on God because we don't understand. And so, we may not understand all of the providential things that happen to us, but we can keep our trust in God. So, what was Pharaoh's dream? Well, he says that one, he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grasses, and behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn, plump and good, were growing on one stalk, and behold, after them sprouted 7 ears thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians in Egypt and the wise men. Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So apparently they may have come up with stuff and Pharaoh just didn't accept it. But again, if they couldn't show by their scrolls and stuff, look, their dream interpretations, they may have had a very difficult time in dealing with this. It seems kind of simple to us, right? There are going to be 7 good and 7 bad, and they're going to be related. But anyway, you kind of have that going on. So at this point, verse 9, the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my, actually that's sins, right? My offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with his own interpretation. The young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When he told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about, I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And he was shaved clean, because that's the Egyptian way of doing things. And he came before Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh is now going to reiterate the dream. You notice that he says in verse 16, it's not in me, right? God will give Pharaoh the favorable answer. So here's my dream. He adds some stuff, right? In verse 19, when he talks about the other cows, he says, I had never seen any in all the land of Egypt, right? So he not only reiterates the dream, but he tells part of his impressions. Verse 20, the end of verse 24, I told the magicians, but none could explain it to me. They may have given him some stuff, but apparently he's not buying it from them. So Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what is about to do. 7 good cows are 7 years, and 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dreams means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning young man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it, that food shall be in reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are occurred in the land, so that the land may not perish through famine. And so, most of us are kind of familiar with that. So Pharaoh describes the dream, and we have this kind of a diagnosis of the dream, a prognosis. This is what's going to happen, and he even gives a prescription, right? This is what you ought to do. How much of this came from God in the interpretation? How much of this is Joseph's 13 years of experience being a servant, and just how, he's been in some pretty high, you've got the captain of the guard and all of that. So he's seen some administration going on. Anyway, this proposal pleased Pharaoh. He thought, you know what, I skipped that one. There's the picture of the dreams and all that. I thought that was up there. But verse 37, it pleased Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man such as this? in whom is the Spirit of God. And again, you just wonder whether or not they're just saying, his God's really doing a lot for him, so we ought to pay attention. Whether they've kind of moved, I don't think we've seen any indication that they've just all of a sudden become monotheists because of Joseph or any of that. But they recognize that. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. And so he appoints. We'll pick that up. We'll kind of pick up there in verse 46 and move forward next week.